Welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, a podcast from Aberdeen discussing the latest trends to keep you and your business at the top of your class. And now, here's your host, Aberdeen's CMO in residence, Matthew Grant.
Hello, and welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, the podcast that focuses on the ways that organizations just like yours are using data to make their business more intelligent. I'm your host, Matthew Grant, CMO in residence here at Aberdeen. This week on the show, we're speaking with Scott Clendaniel, lead data scientist in the Strategic Artificial Intelligence Lab at Legg Mason. We invited Scott to the show to talk about how companies should and shouldn't apply AI to the problems they're trying to solve. Let's dive in. So Scott, welcome to the Intelligent Business Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to get into how people can actually use artificial intelligence to take advantage and make the most or leverage the data assets they have inside their organizations, or not use AI, as I think we'll probably get around to. But before I do that, I did want to say your title, as stated on LinkedIn, the social media site of record for human beings' titles, you're called Lead Data Scientist at the Strategic Artificial Intelligence Lab at Legg Mason. So first of all, that's really cool. Like, you're from the future.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, I don't know.
If I could only bring the football scores with me, we'd be in good shape.
Exactly. Though I don't know if the movies are any indication, the future may be some horrible dystopia run by AIs that just want to, can't eat humans or use them as batteries. So anyway, maybe you are from the future, and that's what this whole show is about, is laying the groundwork for this weird AI in the future.
If I start calling you Copper Top, you'll know why.
Wow, I know. Now all human beings are just Energizer bunnies.
There you go.
All right. So we'll get around to what the Strategic Artificial Intelligence Lab at Legg Mason does. But I wanted to start at sort of a higher or maybe lower level in terms of talking about, companies have all this internal data. And I think companies are also waking up to the fact that this can be a very valuable asset. I mean, we've had people on the show talking about how it might actually be a valuable asset to sell on the open market, or at least get used for partnership development, things like that. But I think one of the things we talked about prior to the show was how companies can use these data assets to actually get better as companies. So I think especially when we're throwing around things like artificial intelligence, people might say wow, man, I'd love to take advantage of my data assets, but that sounds like it's above my pay grade. One of the things that you were quick to say when we were talking about this is that taking advantage of your data assets can be easier than you think. And one thing specifically you said, it's all about adapting the right tool to the right problem at the right time. So maybe we can take that apart. How can it be easier than you think?
I think the best way to explain it is to give some examples. When I used to do consulting, and I did that for about 20 years.
Okay.
Many times I would be brought in to build an AI model, and what would happen was I would ask them, well, what type of data do you have now, and what type of reports do you have now, and what's the problem you're trying to solve? And you would be shocked how many times they already had the answers to the problems in reports they were already producing. The problem was reports really don't have anywhere to go to die when they've outlived their usefulness. So everyone's always afraid to stop the request for a report that's currently being produced. So instead, they just stop reading it. So tons and tons of organizations have a huge stream of great data that's coming to them now that people have forgotten about, or they've stopped using, or people have changed positions. So one of the things that I think is really important for everyone is to start with what's the problem you're trying to solve, and then check with your IT folks and see what types of reports are already being produced before you reinvent the wheel and decide that you need an artificial intelligence solution. Right. So that's one piece.
Okay.
Second piece is, and we're going to go really old school here. There are a lot of folks who don't even understand some of the capabilities that they have right now in plain old Microsoft Excel.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. One is pivot tables. A lot of organizations have very smart people who don't know how to build a pivot table, and in many cases don't know how to read the results of a pivot table. So let's say, for example, you're faced with a problem of trying to figure out who your best customer prospect might be. And they haven't even gone through their old email lists, identified with a 1 or a 0 on who responded and who didn't, and then take each of the individual things that they knew about that person as a column, put them in a pivot table, and then just sorted by the response rate. Many times organizations find that there's a ton of information that's available right there. Third example is there aren't a whole lot of organizations out there now who aren't using their website, and almost all of them have access to Google Analytics or a similar type of tool, but they don't really understand how to get the important information back out of it once it goes in. So instead of having a data warehouse or a data mart, they end up with what I would call a data penitentiary. Mm-hmm. The data goes in, but never seems to quite come back out again. So there are a lot of abilities that are just within those tools that they already have that wouldn't cost them any more money incrementally just to get a feel for how to solve the particular problem they're facing.
Or did you also find that people didn't really know how to formulate the problem in a way that was going to,
Sure,
that the answer was going to kind of present itself?
Absolutely. That you'll frequently have cases where people are trying to solve the wrong problem, and that wastes a lot of hours. I can't tell you how many organizations I've worked with in the past whose solution to every single problem is, oh, well, the reason why that's happening is we need more training. Well, maybe, but is the issue that's trying to be solved even in the hands of the people you're about to train? And if it isn't, that's probably not going to work really well. An old maxim of business is you can't control it if you can't measure it. So making sure that you understand what you're trying to control and making sure that you have the appropriate measurements to match is the first step. So, for example, let's say you're driving your car down the road and you notice that the check engine light comes on. And you're worried about that. Well, one thing you could do is disconnect the check engine light. Well, the check engine light will stop flashing, but I'm not sure that's really solving the underlying problem. Now let's pretend you're in the same situation. You're driving down the highway and the fuel gauge shows empty. Well, disconnecting the fuel gauge isn't going to solve the problem. And also checking the oil pressure, because we like that measurement better, because that looks like that's okay, probably isn't such a good idea either.
I do like the idea that when the check engine light comes on, the problem is that the check engine light's on.
Exactly.
Or I don't like what the fuel gauge is telling me right now. So, so I think, it's interesting because, I've certainly seen this kind of almost from the opposite side. Working in marketing departments and things like that, of people producing things without thinking about what the final outcome is going to be. So it's kind of the flip side. You're trying to create an activity, but suddenly creating the activity becomes the goal.
Absolutely. Well, a classic retail situation like that, let's pretend you work in a menswear store, and the organization has suddenly decided that many of their most profitable customers have 5 or more items in a given purchase on a trip to a given store. And then the organization decides, yep, that's what we're going to solve. We're going to make sure that everybody increases the number of products on their given purchase, and that's going to solve everything. And then later on, they realize that the men's store has a sock rack with socks for $3 for $10. Well, it becomes really easy for the salespeople there to say, hey, why don't we add 3 socks for $10 and you'll get a great deal on this. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Except that what you find out is they're not making any money on the socks in the first place. So what you've done is you've caused all kinds of inventory problems. And my heavens, are you selling a bunch of socks? But you haven't really solved the profitability problem.
So I do want to find out now, just my curiosity has been piqued. People don't really think through clearly the problem that they're trying to solve. The other issue is that people don't necessarily know what data they already have on hand to actually solve this problem. So how do people solve that issue?
Sure. I'll tell you one of the ways that a lot of organizations don't use, but turns out to be pretty helpful, is they bring in their database administrator and suggest to them that they need to cut out 90% of the tables that are in the database. And they want the database administrator to explain to them why we still need those tables. Does wonders to focus the mind of everyone involved, because obviously the database administrator doesn't want to lose valuable data.
Yeah.
And the people on the other end don't want to fool with tables they can't understand. And when you put it in those terms, we're about to lose a set of data that we currently have. It makes everyone think about, well, why should we still have this data? What is this data actually doing for us? And it's a great way for everybody to take a look at things, as opposed to bring in a database administrator and say, hey, why don't you explain your tables to me? That can be a painful exercise for all the parties involved. So if you take it from the idea of what would happen if we got rid of a lot of this data, it brings the actual value to light. And then folks can actually pretend that they're going to go through an exercise and eliminate 90% of the tables, because what that forces people to do is to assign a value, real or imaginary, to the data itself and prioritize it. Once you have that exercise completed, it's a lot easier to figure out what you have. A second way to do it is to say, what is the biggest point of pain we have in the organization right now? What is just driving everybody bonkers, or what's the biggest industry threat? And then to say, okay, what data do we have that matches this? As opposed to trying to understand all the data at the same time. And working with your database team is a great way to try and figure out where those gems might be.
Right. So part of it is doing a real accounting for your data, and treating it truly like an asset, which any other assets you would be assigning values to them and deciding whether you need to keep them or not. But it's funny, data, partly because of the kind of evanescent nature of it, I think people, I don't know, it's almost like they assume the value is latent, but also intangible or ineffable, maybe.
I think that the industry is partly to blame. When I first started off, the answer to everything was you were going to have a data warehouse. What you really need is a data warehouse.
Yeah.
And the organizations who tried to sell the data warehouses needed to come up with a way to justify the expense of the data warehouse to the organization. So they would go in and they'll say, well, the data warehouse by itself is going to be an expense. But the way you're going to get all this money back is you're going to come up with these amazing analytics and predictive models. And they're going to save you so much money that it's going to be worth the expense of the data warehouse. So the industry goes charging into the data warehouse space. And then the industry comes back and says, no, that's not really what you need. What you need are data marts. You need specialized areas of the data warehouse where it's completely focused on what you need as opposed to the organization as a whole. And the way you're going to pay for it are these amazing analytics and predictive models. And they're going to save you so much money, it's going to cover the cost. Okay. And then the industry says, business intelligence. Well, you can imagine what happens, and the cycle repeats.
Right.
But my favorite of the whole group was the big data push, because it used to be that large organizations had tons of stuff stored on their servers, but they weren't doing anything with it. And so the industry came back and said, tell you how you're going to solve this problem. You're going to take all those old catalogs, for example, that everyone in your industry has put out, and you're going to put them in the database, and then you're going to have access to them. So what happened was they used to take server A, which just had the data there, but then they suddenly said, it's in the data lake. Well, of course, it's still completely useless to people if they're not actually doing something with structuring the unstructured data. But then they're able to go back in the organization and say, it's in the data lake, so it's actually in the database. Oh, great, fantastic. Well, if you're not using the data, you don't have the tools to take advantage of those catalogs, you're still in the same boat.
Right. There's also, I guess there's also this belief, even the way that you're describing it, is that and maybe this is also just part of the hype around big data or something like that, is, yeah, to the layperson, it might seem that catalogs from 10 years ago are worthless. But you know what? The big data algorithms can go find nuggets in that stuff as if by magic somehow. And so it kind of encourages a kind of data hoarding, but without the data accounting you were talking about, and a kind of pushing off into the future thanks to kind of wishful thinking about somehow technology will be able to spin this flax of data into virtual gold, if I'm not.
Well, and I think part of the challenge is start with the stuff where you know you have a pressing organizational issue. Figure out where that data is first. Figure out what to do with the catalogs from 10 years ago after that, unless that's your number one issue. Because I don't really know how these organizations get away with it in terms of selling all these solutions that are basically all supposed to produce the same result. But I think that there are certain executives who have been taken advantage of with, AI is going to produce magic for you. You just put the data in and miracles come out the other end.
Right.
And I always have to stop potential clients and say, jokingly, the word model and the word magic are both 5-letter words that begin with the letter M. That doesn't mean they're the same. So you really need to understand what a model can do for you and what it can't do for you. But it certainly isn't magic, and you need to understand that going in.
Right. And so as you said when we were also, you had said to me earlier, focus on the problem, stop reading press releases, is one message here. So as we move into the kind of final segment of our time here, I think it would be valuable for folks to hear about the work, since we've talked about why, in a sense, don't rush full steam ahead into AI. You might actually be able to solve some of the problems or answer some of the questions that you have about the problems you're facing by using technology that people have already know how to use, like Microsoft Excel has capabilities that people can learn how to use, like pivot tables. But there are then cases for the application of AI. And I mean, in fact, it's what your job is right now. So could we spend this last bit talking about some of the work you've done at Legg Mason and how you've gone about, the problems you've been focused on and how you've gotten executive buy-in and kind of what your approach has been to actually using AI to solve real problems?
Yeah, the approach that we took was to go ahead and take a look across the organization. And I sort of view myself as attempting to enable other areas of the organization to take advantage of these technologies. New technologies can be very frightening. So you need to make sure when you're getting that buy-in that people aren't fearing that everyone's going to lose their job or they're going to lose control or that they're going to have some stranger or a computer tell them how their job should be done. One of the ways to scare people even more is to say, I'm here from the analytics department and I'm here to help. Now give me all the data that you have, as opposed to saying, here, let me help you take advantage of the data that you have and solve the problems that you have the fastest and easiest way possible. So the idea of creating this as a lab was I do research and development on different types of algorithms that might help the organization, and then try and meet with other groups across the organization and say, help me know exactly what you need to solve and see if we have a tool in the toolbox that'll meet your needs. And if we don't, how can we develop one? And then you can take on the project if you want, or if you don't have enough arms and legs to do it, let us help you with that, and we'll do some of the initial projects and some of the initial legwork, make it easier for you. And in that way, it doesn't become a situation of, I've come here to take power away from you. It becomes more of, I've come here to give you control of taking away your own problems and solving the problem as you see best fit.
Right. So the lab then was set up as a kind of organization-wide resource that's because you can't expect people or stakeholders within each organization to spend their time learning how to do AI and apply it to their problems. But if you have one central resource doing that, then the entire organization can benefit.
Well, and also the central resource can provide training to the different departments, which is one of the things that I specialize in, is to provide knowledge transfer to everybody so that they can become their own expert over time at the pace that they're comfortable with and at the level that they need to be.
Nice. So are there any successes that you've had that you're allowed to talk about? I mean, that aren't proprietary?
No successes. It's been, I'm sorry. Yes, there have been some successes, one or two at least. One of the things that we've done is we've developed a very close relationship with the analytics department in our business development group so that we can help sales teams prioritize leads in terms of who's most likely to be involved in increasing their total assets under management, helping them identify and prioritize leads who are most likely to take an incremental product from one of our affiliates. And in both those cases, it becomes a resource which the sales and distribution team can take advantage of, as opposed to you must do this or you must do that.
Right.
And those have both worked out sort of shockingly well. The last project they work on had a 975% leftover baseline.
Wow. I'm not a math guy, but that sounds like a lot.
Yeah, that's actually what we call it in the field, a lot. Yes, that's a technical term,
Nice. So it's interesting because AI can work, but it can be super beneficial, especially when it sounds like when modeling prospects and identifying real opportunities to take advantage of and things like that. So I think, are there other, I guess one of the things we had talked about also when I spoke with you earlier was, and this goes back even to what we were talking about at the top, which is really aligning the technology and the tools with the problem you're trying to solve. And if the problem isn't super, super complicated and isn't super data intensive, then maybe you don't need someone with a PhD in statistics to solve it. But so I think focusing on what problems are kind of appropriate for some of the more advanced technologies. We had talked about deep learning, for example, and you said deep learning, which again, like people could treat like magic in the hypothetical case of the online catalogs. That's probably not a good application of deep learning. It's not magic. But you said that there were 3 cases where, as you saw, deep learning could be very, very valuable and a very appropriate tool.
Oh, there are probably many cases. Deep learning can find extremely subtle connections in data. So a lot of projects that deal with originally unstructured data, deep learning can handle very well. So for example, if you're trying to do image recognition, deep learning is the right solution for you. If you're trying to do audio recognition or simultaneous translation, deep learning is absolutely your solution. If you want to get every last bit of benefit out of ridiculously large databases or single files or tables that you're going at, where it goes into terabytes of information, deep learning is an amazing source. Those are the use cases where deep learning makes the most sense to me. However, we've run several experiments against smaller data sets or more straightforward problems like fraud detection or response modeling or churn prediction. And in those cases, actually deep learning is a real challenge because it's very slow to train. It is very slow to score. It takes a ridiculous amount of data, and it's almost a complete black box. So you get to the end of the process, and the question I always have is, if you don't understand it when it's working, what are you going to do when it breaks? You're going to restart the whole project? Well, how do you know that you're not going to repeat the same issues if you don't know what caused the model to drift in the first place? So there are cases where it is the right solution, and it should be used there. most cases are not a good profile for a deep learning solution.
Yeah.
And yet, if you read the industry literature, it's almost all deep learning all the time these days.
Yeah, it's funny when you were when you were talking about deep learning and running these experiments, but also something you had said earlier about what you do in the lab. It made me suddenly think of a data scientist as almost an artificial biologist. Like you were because you were talking about building algorithms and testing them out. I almost kind of imagined you cultivating them somehow and seeing which ones thrived and which ones didn't. Am I way off in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
I think it has to do with, for lots of different problems for an individual organization. So, for example, we work in financial services, asset management. Much of our data is going to be used to solve similar problems. So getting a real good handle and profiles of our data on the front end was one of the first things we took advantage of. And a team completely separate from mine, who I would love to take the credit for, but I had nothing to do with it, came up with an enterprise data hub across the entire organization and migrated all that to AWS. So they did a tremendous amount of work in standardizing definitions and data elements, democratizing access, creating denormalized views so people could get easy access to the data. Huh. When that is done for you, you have a huge head start. So then my research is mostly on what is the best way to solve this particular problem. Yes. What are data elements which offer a lot of promise that we have right now, that we can take advantage of right now? For example, in the cross-sell analysis case that I was just referring to, the project that we worked on, we did not take every data element in the entire database and leverage it against the problem. Right. We actually took it in slices. So we got most of the benefit in the very first set of data that we had. And then we successfully introduced additional data elements in sort of a piecemeal effort and then put the whole thing together as opposed to trying solving everything at once. So those are the types of projects and approaches we do. Don't try and boil the ocean. Don't try and do everything at the same time. You're going to set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, and it also sounds like you have to, all the prep work and working the data, defining the data as you were describing, organizing the data, doing all these things first is absolutely crucial, or else your data scientist is spending all their time doing that stuff rather than working on solving the problems that matter to the organization.
Sure, and you don't have to solve every data issue in the organization before you put together a pivot table.
Yeah.
Don't try and do everything at once. It's a recipe for failure, frustration, and for programs being canceled.
All right, Scott, on that note, I just want to thank you very much for being on the Intelligent Business Show. It was really fun, and I won't get nervous if you call me Copper Top.
No, okay. All right. I feel better now.
Okay. All right. So have a great day.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Next week, we'll be talking with John Murdoch, CEO at Centage. Specifically, we'll be talking about intelligent planning in the small to medium-sized enterprise. Join us then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intelligent Business Show. You can find this show on iTunes and Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at Aberdeen_show. And if you want to know what's going on in your market space, be sure to check out Aberdeen.com.